Welcome to this community conversation with the police. As a result of the civil unrest this past year that was precipitated by certain conduct in the national law enforcement community, the city has been asked to explain some of the policies and procedures that we use here in our local police department. An ad hoc committee was formed and decided that a conversation with our police department was a good platform to educate the community on local police policies and procedures. Due to COVID, the committee felt a virtual presentation would be best. An online question form was made available to the public, and we have received many good inquiries from you. We have done our best to incorporate them into several categories that we will discuss today. And those categories include, and I will read them, an overview of the Baraboo Police Department, our use of force policy, mental health, racial and ethnic diversity in policing practices, and immigration status. We value your interest in what our police department does and how they operate. At this time, I would like to introduce our moderator, Jenny Erickson, from the UW Extension, and Police Chief Mark Schauf.
Thanks, Mayor Palm. It's a joy to be with you today. And as the mayor mentioned, I have a series of questions that were submitted by the public, and I'm going to shoot those off to our Chief Schauf. And I thought we could start on Chief Schauf with just an overview of the Baraboo PD. How many officers do you have? What's the makeup? Can you give us an overview, please?
Sure. A lot of people realize that they see the squad cars out there 24/7. We do have a 24/7 service, obviously. Baraboo is made up of 29 sworn police officers. Of that 29, they're broken into a patrol division and into a detective division. They work at different hours. We run two shifts, 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. and 5 p.m. to 5 a.m. for patrol. Our breakup of our officers for gender, that was one of our questions. We actually have 3 female police officers, so there's just over 10% of our department is female, a little below the national and state average. National average is about 12% for female officers. The rest of our officers are white males. We do not have a whole lot of diversity within our department. It's actually one of the things that we're working with our Police and Fire Commission to try and increase our recruiting, and that's something we can talk a little bit about later on as far as how we're going to try and find the next batch of officers for the Baraboo Police Department, because we are continually recruiting, we continually have a list, and we are trying to keep moving forward.
Great. Could you talk a little bit more about your recruitment process and what kind of steps you might be taking to diversify your staff?
Well, so it's an interesting challenge is that we can't hire the people that don't apply. And getting those applications is difficult. One of our challenges we have in Baraboo is dollars as it comes down to it. So to be a police officer in the state of Wisconsin, you have to be at least 18 years old. In Baraboo, we say you have to be 20 and a half. You have to have at least 60 college credits. You have to have attended police academy. And that's one of the sticky wickets for people, is that as we found, not only do we have issues within racial diversity, but we have socioeconomic issues that we're addressing as the police and the police department. Because sometimes people can't afford to go to college or go back to college after they get some maturity and some life experience to get those police academies. Because academy costs about $5,000. And most people can't take away from their working job or their paying job to attend that 16-week academy. But we as the police department can't necessarily afford in our budget to turn around and pay someone to be gone for 16 weeks for training. So it's a catch-22 that we've been working with our Police and Fire Commission on how we can increase the recruiting and how we can be more attractive to those not only racial issues but the socioeconomic issues that we face.
Excellent. Thank you. I wanted to shift gears for a second and talk a little bit about use of force. We got lots of questions submitted from the public around use of force policies. Can you talk a little bit about or outline what the Baraboo PD's use of force policies are?
Sure. It's going to be not only Baraboo, but the state of Wisconsin. So all of police officers are judged on a couple of things, a couple of federal case laws that we hear about. We had a lot of questions about qualified immunity and those kind of things that really, that's a different discussion than use of force. So let's talk specific about use of force. So every police officer is trained in academy. I mentioned the police academy before. So a police academy has 40 hours of defense and arrest tactics training. That is where they learn how to use the different use of force hands-on. There's also 40 hours of firearms training where they learn how to use the guns, the less lethal munitions like beanbag shotguns and things like that. That's just the academy. You need to do that and pass certain things to get certified or be listed as certifiable by Wisconsin Training and Standards or the state of Wisconsin. When we then hire a police officer, they have to have that training and they come to us. We have in-house experts that are trained, they're certified state DAT and firearms instructors. And we actually take and have every one of our new police officers go through a use of force module and qualify with their weapons. So just because they've had the training doesn't mean that they're up to our standard. We bring them here and we check them to make sure that they have our they have not only the standard that we have, but the understanding of what we expect within our policy. So they have to read every policy when they get hired and get trained in each one of those policies, but they also have to demonstrate an ability to do the work within the policy. So use of force falls then into multiple categories, and believe it or not, I'm using force against everyone in the room right now. By definition within state law, a police officer's very presence is the use of force, and I can demonstrate it quickly, and everybody listening or watching can feel this. So if you've ever been driving down the highway and you saw that squad car sitting on the side of the road and you took your foot off the gas pedal, that officer just used force against you. Because the definition of force is getting something done or making something happen. So that officer may never have had contact with you, may never pull out after you, but made you change your behavior because what you were doing. They used force against you by their very presence. And so that's actually one of our favorite ways to use force, is if we show up and everything stops, that is a good day for us because we can just do our work. Because really, I hate to say it this way, but we don't want to use force. There's a risk of us getting hurt. There's a risk of the people getting hurt. We don't want to use force, but sometimes our job compels us that we have to use force. So then we go into what we call empty hand, or verbal first. We start saying, "Stop, police." And we've all seen that on TV. Then we get into empty hand techniques, where if we have to take hold of somebody, sometimes we use what we call the decentralization, where we take them to the ground if they're physically assaultive, up to intermediate weapons where we have our tasers and our batons and things of that nature, all the way up to deadly force, and we'll talk about that in more specific detail later on. I think we have some questions that talk about that. So use of force is actually a continuum. That continuum is set by the state of Wisconsin, and we follow those rules. The other part about the use of force that's really important for people to understand is that those experts that I mentioned that train our police officers early on, they also review all of our use of force. If a police officer uses any level of force beyond simple handcuffing, so if I were to go and say, get called to a theft report, and I get there and yes, there's probable cause to believe that a crime is committed and that person did it, and I say, you know what, you're under arrest, turn around, and I put them into handcuffs. They cooperate, they turn around, handcuffs are applied. That use of force does not indicate an automatic review, unless there's a complaint of an injury or something like that. If I have to use more force than that, I have to grab hold of them, I have to take them to the ground, I have to force them to do something, now it gets reviewed. And so anytime that our weapons are pointed at somebody, that gets reviewed by these subject matter experts. It's also important to understand for our use of force that the Baraboo Police Department is the only police department in Sauk County that every officer is issued a body camera. We have body-worn cameras for every one of our police officers. And those are tools that our use of force experts, our instructors, review as they're determining, and along with the report, and to determine if the force that was used by the officer was, number one, appropriate. Number two, fell within the guidelines of our policy and the state of Wisconsin. So use of force is very important. It is not only very litigious, but it's important for the community to know that we take it very seriously, and that's how we apply it and use it. And I realize I've been talking a lot and kind of going on about things, but the use of force as a conversation is very important. And I want people to understand how important we understand it to be.
So I know there's a lot of detail in use of force, and we got some specific questions from folks about this from recent events, right? So can you talk a little bit about our chokeholds? Could you talk a little bit about if an officer feels a threat, do they shoot to kill, or can you shoot somebody in the leg and just kind of slow them down? Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic?
We certainly can. So as we're looking at use of force, we always use force that's appropriate to the situation. If we have a person who is involved with hands punching, we arrive at a fight and there's no weapons involved, it's not appropriate for an officer to go to a potential deadly force option. Firearm, running into them with a car, anything like that. So we train our officers to respond to the level of threat that they are experiencing. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, it's a continuum, it can go up. So anytime that police are using force, we are trying to stop the behavior that is in front of us. So if people are punching each other and we say, stop or I'm going to tase you, our use of the taser is an attempt to stop the conduct that we are experiencing. And that goes all the way up to deadly force. The definition of deadly force can be used when there's a threat to life or the great bodily injury to another person. And that's when we can use that to either protect ourselves or to protect other people. When we use deadly force, we use it to stop the threat. We don't use it to try and wound, we do it to stop the threat. And so by stopping the threat, what we're doing is getting whatever we are perceiving to be the deadly force alternative that's in front of us to stop. If the person has a weapon, a knife, and we point a firearm at them and we say, drop the knife, and they drop the knife, it is no longer appropriate for us to escalate that force. We would then have to de-escalate the force to the appropriate level to take that person into custody. So anytime that we would shoot, we don't aim for legs to shoot to wound. It just isn't a way we can train. Understand that cops are people too. And it's incredibly stressful and it's incredibly difficult as things are going that fast to make appropriate adjustments. And we train to do it. We train to break the cycle. We train to break the video and auditory exclusions that happen and train our officers to be the best that they can. So anytime that we use force to be able to say, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shoot him in the foot to try and stop the behavior, it just isn't conducive. It can't happen. Training is to stop the threat, and we always shoot to stop the threat at a center mass. So to answer the question about shooting, no, we don't shoot to wound. We shoot to stop the threat every time. And once the threat stops, we stop. As to chokeholds, chokeholds are actually a deadly force option. So our policy does not allow for chokeholds to be used unless it's deadly force. So if I needed to or had the ability because the person was in danger of killing someone else or giving great bodily harm to someone else, and I would be justified to use my firearm, I'm now justified to use a chokehold. That's the only time we do that. Some states in the United States used to allow this as a control measure. Most are going away from it. The state of Wisconsin has never allowed it as a true control measure. It is only allowed as a deadly force option, and we don't train it. We don't train on how to use it. We don't train how to do it. It shouldn't happen.
Great. So you've alluded to this a little bit already, but how many investigations has there been in the last, say, 10 years regarding use of force or shooting in the Baraboo Police Department?
Well, I can tell you that every use of force beyond simple handcuffing is investigated and reviewed. So just as an example, in 2020, we had 45 cases of reported use of force. And that doesn't mean that there were 45 incidents. If 2 officers on a case used different levels of force, each would be reviewed independently as to what that officer saw at that time and the force that they used. It goes into another, if a lot of questions came up with George Floyd about why the other officers didn't intervene. And that's one of the things that we review. Should someone have intervened in this case if there was an inappropriate level of force? So we have had complaints about excessive force. That's not uncommon. The most common complaint we get is that the handcuffs are put on too tight. I hear that a couple times a year, and we evaluate on how we do that. Up to and including, we've had people that have reported that use of force was too extreme. I shouldn't have been taken to the ground, something to that nature. Each one of those is reviewed independently, and if we get a complaint, that is even scrutinized further. The other way that is important for everybody to understand is that Baraboo is a WILEAG accredited agency. That's the Wisconsin Law Enforcement Accreditation Group. We meet a standard of more than 240 areas that we demonstrate the best practice in law enforcement. And each one of those is reviewed every 3 years. And we have to show proofs for every year that we're doing that. One of the standards in there is that every year, as the chief of police, I sit down and I review every use of force for that year to determine if there's any patterns, if there's any areas that there's specific excessive use, or even if there was an officer that was using more force than others. And what we would do if we encountered something like that, depending on the nature of what it was take appropriate disciplinary action if we had to. But more likely on a lot of those is an educational opportunity. Maybe we can sit down with an officer and say, hey, you've used this force twice this year. I don't know if that was the best, but maybe there's other force options that we can do. And we have them sit with our force experts and determine the best course of action at that point.
So you've mentioned that officers want to avoid excessive use of force. So de-escalation's got to be really important. Can you talk a little bit about how do you de-escalate a situation? What does it look like?
Well, and I'm actually going to, not even excessive force. We want to avoid force in general. We do not want to apply force when we can avoid it, because that's where people get hurt, including our police officers, including this police officer. Back in 2019, I had a personal incident where I had to use force against a subject who had injured one of the police officers. I ended up having knee surgery out of the deal because I ruined my knee. It was a long recovery, and I don't wish that on anyone. And we don't want our cops getting hurt, and our cops don't want to get hurt. They want to go home to their families, just like everybody wants to go home to their families. So the de-escalation is something that's originally taught in academy. So it's a common theory. And I mentioned it earlier that we have this force continuum that you can step up if you need to based on the force level you have. And it's important for people to understand too that if I show up on scene because we've got a report of somebody who's actively shooting an ongoing active violent situation, it's not expected that I show up and say, hello, my name is Mark, I'm here to help you today. No, I'm going to respond with the appropriate level of force to defend myself and to defend others. So the program developed by the state and proven by the state gives us the opportunities with those force options as we go. Anytime that there's a change, and we are constantly monitoring, we need to be able to de-escalate. So de-escalation can start as simply as showing up on scene. There are times when the simple act of a police officer being there is enough for a person to go, okay, hey, I'm done. And I've had countless stories of police officers not, as much as de-escalating, it's important not to escalate. An example we had a couple of years ago that I happened to be part of is there was a subject in one of our local establishments who had an active warrant for violent crimes. The officer went in, tapped him on the shoulder and said, hey, there's a warrant for you, let's go. And he looked the officer up and down and said, nope, go get some of your friends. So the officer, instead of trying to be the big macho person, said, okay, went out, called for more friends. 2 officers go in. Nope, not enough of you. Okay, called for more. When 4 officers got there, he looked up and down, took a last drink off his drink and said, let's go. Patience and intelligence is the first step towards and getting that contempt of cop out of there, that I'm only doing this because I'm a police officer and you have to follow my lawful and legal order. So that's the first thing that we teach officers is, you know what, find alternatives to using force. And then if you do have to use force, use it quickly, use it decisively, and then back off once you've gained control. So de-escalation starts with communication. There's a lot of different lessons that we've taught, and we've actually had classes on de-escalation. Our defense and arrest tactics instructors, specifically after the events of last summer, we sat down and had a 4-hour training with every police officer in the Baraboo Police Department where we reviewed not only body cam footage, but news footage of cases like George Floyd. And we had the officers look at it and saying, what could you have done differently at this point? How do you do this differently? And the best teacher is experience. So de-escalation starts with communication. It continues throughout, and there is no magic recipe, but understanding too the contributing factors, and we'll get into some of this later as we talk about mental illness, substance abuse and its application with mental illness and how those things react to us. So the de-escalation is something we teach. We've had special classes on it. We've had specific trainings for our police officers on de-escalation, and it all starts with talking, is the best way to put that.
Well, thanks. You just led us into the next conversation, which is all around mental health. How does the Baraboo PD address mental health related calls? Do the officers have specific training related to those kind of calls?
We do. It's important to recognize that there's a multitude of levels of training for mental health and mental health issues. Critical incident teams that understand mental illness and how those impact a person are important. We've had trainings on something called mental health first aid for first responders. We've had several officers that have had that training. We've have about, I think, 4 police officers that have gone through critical incident training, which is the training that is recognized as the best right now. We had a couple of people that were scheduled to go through training late this fall, but cases got in the way and money got in the way and we weren't able to send them. But we are still looking for the opportunity to train those officers and to train those on those specific techniques. So mental illness is much more prevalent than people realize. Mental illness lends itself to substance abuse, and we recognize that. So when we're dealing with the report of the domestic situation and one of the parties is intoxicated, we have to recognize that that intoxication level may be based on undiagnosed or diagnosed but self-medicated issues. We found a lot of our substance abuse people have mental illness as a backdrop. And it became part of the idea for the Sauk County Criminal Justice CJCC, Criminal Justice Coordinating Committee, thank you, to develop the Sauk County Drug Court. And it was a great program to start, but we've had limited success because these people are not getting all of the mental health support that they need. And that's our challenge in law enforcement is we can recognize it, but it's not illegal to have mental illness. And so our ability to intervene sometimes is difficult, and the resources that we can get for people is somewhat limited. Chapter 5115 of Wisconsin statutes is the ability for a police officer to detain a person who is imminently threatening to harm themselves or someone else. So if a person says, I'm going to kill myself and I'm going to do it this way and I'm going to do it right now, we have probable cause to take that person into custody. And it seems a little weird that the police have that authority because it's a mental illness thing. But the state legislature put it on the police because the police are the people who take away people's civil liberties until the court gets there. Other states, doctors have that ability. They don't have that ability in Wisconsin. And until the law changes, the police are going to have to run that along with the Department of Human Services. Our most recent change is that the police officers have final say along with the Department of Human Services on whether a person is going to be detained on a mental detention. And that detention is 72 hours or until they go in front of a judge. So that's just a stopgap for an imminent threat. It doesn't help the long term. And that's where we have a real desert in Wisconsin, and specifically in Sauk County. We don't have enough health providers for mental health. It just doesn't exist. And there's waiting lines at every place that you talk to. People, you try to get an appointment and they can't be seen for 2 to 3 weeks, 2 to 3 months. It's just not uncommon. And then as you have shortfalls with insurance, people can't afford long-term care, and the resources at Sauk County are just tapped. So we recognize mental illness because we deal with it daily. We deal with it hourly. And as we're responding to different things and the way that people respond to us, we try to get them help. We had a subject just last week who had some PTSD because he had been in service and couldn't get his help here, we were able to give him a conveyance to Toma up to the VA to get help and help that person through that means, because just putting them in the hospital wasn't the answer. They need long-term help. And there is no magic pill. And as people use substances to cover that, that's where we get involved. And then it ends up a bigger picture because we had some questions about drug use and drug houses. And I think one of the contributing factors to drug use is the incredible proliferation of mental illness and people self-medicating because they don't want to admit it. And so that then lends itself to, okay, we have this drug house, or now they're stealing from family members, now they're stealing from their neighbors. There are drug drivers out there that we have to watch for. I love to tout the fact because we have such a talented police officer, but we had the #2 performing drug recognition expert in the state of Wisconsin working for the Baraboo Police Department, catching drug drivers out on the streets. And he's just very good at that. It's great that he's out finding them. The problem is they're out there, and how many aren't being found? That's our concern with drugs and drug driving and drug use in the community and all those ancillary places and the fear that it causes because of drugs. So I realize I kind of went on a whole nother tangent on you there, but mental illness is something that we are aware of. We need help. We understand that it is a primary factor in a lot of the things that we deal with. It is not uncommon for us to deal with mental illness not only here, but in the schools. Anybody who was listening to the scanner this morning heard my school resource officer from the middle school had an at-risk student take off in 10 below weather without a coat and go running through the neighborhoods. And we facilitated getting that student back to mom and getting that student back where they're safe. And that's our goal, is to try and keep everybody safe. But those are the kind of things we're dealing with all the time.
Well, you'd mentioned that mental health calls can be really challenging. Is there another entity or organization that might be better served to handle those kind of calls?
I would say yes, but until the state law changes, they won't be involved. Department of Human Services, social workers, love to have them. I would love to have a department social worker, but you're talking a lot to properly cover 24/7 is going to take a lot of energy and a lot of money. I would love to be able to say, if we have a mental transport from a person, and this is one of our challenges with mental health. So if a person is deemed to need to be detained because they're an imminent threat of harm to themselves or others, we have to put them in a squad car and drive them to Winnebago, which is Winnebago County, which is up just short of Green Bay. So we now put you in a squad car, in the back of a squad car, which isn't where a person with mental health should be, and drive you 2 hours to Winnebago Mental Health. And that isn't conducive to people who are in the middle of a mental crisis. But it's the only resource we have. And nobody has the ability right now to step up and say, yep, we're going to do this. And it's one of the things that the Wisconsin Chief of Police Association has begged the legislature and the government and the governor to try and find alternate resources. Find us hospitals closer that these people can get help from so that we're not dragging them halfway across the state. And for us in Baraboo, it's 2 hours. Boscobel or northern Wisconsin, they're sometimes on the road for 6 hours with these people, dragging them all over the state because it's the only available bed for those people. So are there other entities, not legally, not statutorily, that can step up? And it's a much bigger community crisis, I think, than we realize sometimes with mental health. And the police just see the flare-ups. There's an underlying current there that needs much more attention.
You had mentioned the crisis intervention team, or kind of alluded to it, I think. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that team is about and how many officers from Baraboo are participating?
So I have 4 police officers that are currently trained as crisis intervention. We don't have a specific team in Baraboo. If you talk to Madison Police Department, because of their size, they have officers that are trained on every shift that can respond to a crisis. They also then follow up on those crises so that they're available to check in the next day on these people if they don't end up in some kind of a placement. The officers that we have, 2 of them are involved with the negotiation team because it's specifically relevant, that if we need to talk to a person who is in a crisis, that they have those specialized training and tools. So 2 of our officers are there, along with multiple officers from Sauk County that are part of that critical incident negotiation team. The other officers that we have had the training and are able to apply the tactics and the techniques of that and the verbalization of that. Eventually, I'd like to get everybody trained. It just finding the ability to get everybody away, because we still have a job to do here. We can't just say, hey, we're not going to respond to calls today because we're sending everybody to training. And that particular training is a week long. So getting people to the training is pretty tough. And there are some federal grant dollars, and some of our partners through the CJCC at the county are able to help us with that. And we are working towards that.
I'm going to switch gears one more time and talk a little bit about racial issues, racial diversity in policing policies. So can you talk a little bit about how does the Baraboo PD recognize implicit bias? What kind of training have you done with your staff? Are there any specific examples you could share?
So implicit bias is definitely recognized by the Baraboo Police Department. We've been training on this for more than 10 years. As part of our accreditation, it's one of our actual accreditation ticks, boxes that we have not only recognized, but that we train on implicit bias and the impacts on modern policing. So we do that every year. We have trainings, and it happens at different levels. So it may be a portion that's incorporated to our defense and arrest tactics training. One thing that's important to understand for everybody at home, everybody thinks about teachers, and when teachers have to do their in-service training, police officers have in-service training that we do every year as well. So statutorily, we're required to do a minimum of 24 hours every year. Every police officer has to maintain our certification. We do a lot more than that. Our officers are probably averaging somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 hours per year that we are doing training. We also do our internal training in the police department. So we're able to tailor what we're doing. We're not just sending officers off to get concepts and come back. We will have an officer go to a training, bring back that idea to us here, and then be able to train on that. One of the examples on that is we have an officer who went and got specialized training on dealing with suicides and dealing with suicidal people, and he's able to now come, and we're setting up a training where that officer can share with the other 28 of us what he learned at that training. And it's the best bang for our buck, where the primary principles are shared back to us, and as many people as we can at least get a flavor of it. They may not be that expert that he is now that he's gone through the training, but that we're working on getting that training. So, and that's just one area. So then as you talk implicit bias, and for those at home, implicit bias is that natural bias that every one of us has. We recognize that. We hope some people will recognize they have implicit bias as well. And we train to try and get around it. It's not always easy. But the first step in anything is to understand that it exists, and our officers do. Within the last 6 months, our officers have done 2 one-hour blocks just on racial equity, including racial equity within the workplace, and diversity within the workplace, and diversity within communities, and understanding some of the numbers. So I had mentioned earlier that we don't have a proper representation of our police department of minority officers, but that's actually a nationwide problem. So nationwide, there are roughly 697,195 sworn police officers in the United States. Of that, 65% are white, and the other 12.8% are African American, and the other minorities and or multiple nationalities together make up the bulk of that number. That number is very disproportionately different in rural Midwest areas. Most of the officers of color are found within larger urban areas. Part of that is the simple thing that I talked earlier about the socioeconomics and the ability that most of these large police departments run their own police academies and pay the the cadets to go through, where smaller communities like Midwest Wisconsin can't afford that. So it's where that diversity issue comes. And part of the problem with diversity is people have to realize that you have to understand people, and to understand people, you have to get to know people. And so officers work towards that. They work towards getting to know the people within their community, and they work towards understanding the people of those different races and backgrounds. One of the questions that we were talking about was numbers of people on traffic stops. And I actually learned something in this process, which is always a good day, that our new system we have, I can actually pull, and we've now developed a way to do it. So I can tell you that in January, the Baraboo Police Department conducted 129 issued 129 traffic citations. Of those, 125 were issued to white people, 3 to Native Americans, and 1 was an unknown race. In that same time period, in January, we encountered 41 people that were issued criminal citations, notices to appear in court. Of that, 76% of those were white, 11% were African American, and 13% were actually, by number, American Indian. Didn't have any that reported as Hispanic in any of that. So the numbers are somewhat representative of our population, but one of the things to understand with those numbers is if we had one person who happened to be issued 2 citations for a particular event, so if a traffic stop was made for speeding and they didn't have a valid driver's license, those citations would be to the same person, so that may skew the numbers either way. And again, it's just flat data. It hasn't been analyzed as to what it means. But as a police officer, it's tough. It really is, especially in traffic. When I'm doing traffic stops at night, a lot of times I can't see into the car to see who's driving. I can just tell you that car is going 43 miles an hour, and it's a 25 mile an hour zone. So one of the questions I'd been asked as we started this, and we had the conversation, I went to one of the community events over at Ochsner Park, and I was asked, do you stop people because of their race? And the answer is no, but if I'm looking for someone because I just had a crime committed and it's reported that this person did a crime, I might stop them because of their race. If I'm looking for a white male, I'm not going to stop a black male. If I'm looking for a black male, I'm not going to stop a white male. So that's one of the challenges for us in law enforcement is, yes, understanding that implicit bias and that race plays a factor in all of these things, and training our officers to understand that those exist and giving them that experience. But we're also finding more and more that we have a lot more heritage back where we didn't even realize. One of our most recent trainings, we actually watched a video that was put out by one of these DNA companies that will give you your DNA and then show your ancestry, and to show how much all of these things are mixed together and how much people have little pieces of ancestry from all over the world is actually quite interesting, and understanding that bigger picture. So I guess I don't know if it sounds like I'm towing around the question a little bit, but it's such a deep and difficult issue. We do recognize it, and we do train on it.
All right, last kind of block of questions, and we had some, I think, some really good questions around immigration issues, immigration status questions. And so, if someone were stopped for, say, a traffic violation, or they wanted to call in and report a violation, can the Baraboo PD ask them about their immigration status?
Can we? Maybe. Will we? No. So, and this is actually a huge hurdle. We know that there's segments of our population, specifically the Hispanic portions of our population, that have fear of law enforcement for that exact reason. That maybe they've been a victim of a crime and they don't want to report it because they're afraid that we're going to come and call ICE or INS. We don't do that. That's not who we are, and that's not what we do. The only reason that we would deal with an immigration issue is if there is an active immigration warrant for someone. We're required, if there's a warrant, to take somebody into custody. We don't have a choice. That's a command by a judge. We would deal with it then. But if I were to stop someone for a simple speeding violation and they happen to be of Hispanic heritage, and I'm not calling the INS on them. I'm not checking their immigration status. Really, those files are very difficult for us to access. We can, but it's very difficult. And probably 15 years ago, there was an attempt by the INS to be able to do some of that stuff, and we don't participate in that. That's not who the Baraboo Police Department is. As a matter of fact, we've really worked to help with our Hispanic community to develop better relationships. And the city of Baraboo actually worked to do English second language class, and the mayor was very active in that and very involved in that, and it was a great opportunity for the Hispanic people to learn a little bit more about us and for us to learn a little bit more about them. So the other question on that is, if they call, are we going to? If you're the victim of a crime, we're not interested right now. If you are here legally or illegally, you're a victim of a crime, that's what we're worried about.
So do you do any kind of investigation around immigration status at all?
Only generally if there's a warrant. If we were to run someone through because of a traffic stop or for some reason we run them for a person's check and a warrant pops up, we may do some nature of an investigation, but that's going to be an investigation, a warrant for an INS. One of our challenges with warrants is the Hispanic culture and the way that the names work cause for a lot of what we call near hits. So the use of surnames is different than our Anglo-American surnames, and the way the computer program will tell us, okay, so you may be out with this subject with the first surname and the primary name that's different, but it's close. And so then we may have to look at descriptors. We may have to look to see if it's actually the person we're dealing with. And quite frankly, most times we can't discern if it is that person. But actually that's gotten a lot less now too with some of our systems getting a little bit better. But no, we're not going to go and do an INS check on someone.
So I only have one question left, and that is around opportunities for folks that may not be primarily English speakers. If they were to call the department and have a question, do you have any Spanish translation services on hand?
There are services available for us. I've had officers get a little creative and just use the cell phone in the squad and use Google Translate for a quick response to things, up to and including there are services that we can contract with, not only through the jail, but through some other places that we can contact them, and they have translators available via phone. So we can make those translations for the immediacy. And we have translators that we can call in if we need to. So if someone were a victim of a crime and we needed to bring in a translator, we would. The reason we bring that specific person in is if it's a criminal event and we're trying to get the probable cause and the elements, there are certain things that people have to be actually certified as court translators so that they understand the process. But I've used everything from the kids in the house can speak English and they will translate what's going on. The problem there is you don't know what you're actually getting, up into bringing in full translators for long extended periods. And it isn't just for Hispanic. We have a larger incursion of people that are of Polish descent, Russian descent, Ukrainian, and even American Sign Language, recognizing the portion of our population that is deaf and hard of hearing and unable to communicate. We have to be able to get ASL, American Sign Language people in here to be able to tell us what they're signing and find what that is. So it always seems to be some other challenge that we have, but we've been very successful with these programs to be able to communicate with them.
I want to thank Chief Schauf for his all of his responses to these questions today. And as Mayor Paul mentioned, we had so many questions, more than we could get to in the time allotted, but I really want to thank you for participating today.
I'm happy to do so, and I really hope that this starts a communication. One of the programs we used to use was the Police and Fire Academy, and we would invite people in, and when we first started this program more than 20 years ago, we would have 12 to 15 participants, and it was a 10-week program, and we really introduced them to what police was and some of our challenges. We got busy. Everybody got busy and weren't able to participate, and so the program has largely changed. But maybe we can do something that brings people in to show them a little bit more, and this is a great opportunity for us to start a conversation and for people to understand who we are as the police, and so that we can understand more about who we are as a community.
We want to thank you for tuning in today. We value your feedback, and we would like to know from you whether or not you found this helpful, whether or not you have a different understanding of how our police department operates. I think that there's going to be a form supplied by the library that will allow for that to happen. We'd also like to know whether or not you'd like to see this conversation continued, not only for the police department, but we could certainly offer conversations with other city functions such as Public Works, the zoo, our park system, whatever it is that you think that you'd like to learn a little bit more about as to how the city of Baraboo operates, we'd be happy to accommodate that. So I want to thank you all again for listening to this conversation today. And please, if you can take a few minutes, fill out some comments and give those back to the library. Thank you.